Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's such a huge pleasure to see all of you out there to hear a conversation about this incredibly important and often neglected topic, and to introduce the remarkable panelists seated to my right. Kizzy Charles Guzman, the Executive Director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. A quick hand, please. Jamie Alexander, who's both an ambassador for Women Plus in Climate Tech and the Director of Drawdown Labs. And Henna Balok, who is the Executive Director of Sustainability and Environment for General Motors. I really can't imagine a better group of people to have this conversation with. It's going to be fast-paced. We have a lot to get through. We're going to start with a lightning round, setting the scene, and then talk a little bit about the history of how this set of issues, I should say, has been understood, where we are now, and where we want to go in the future. Great. So first, to set the scene, I'll just throw out a couple of data points on women and climate. Governments where there's a higher level of representation of women have more aggressive climate policies, and their nations produce less fossil fuel pollution, which is pretty extraordinary. It's a correlation that holds true across geography. Pretty impressive. It's also true that 80%, fully 80% of people displaced by climate disasters are women and girls. So that's one way of balancing out the two sides of the question, is to think about it like that. And then I'll ask you all to give us a data point or a reflection on gender and leadership, whether or not it intersects fully with climate, to get us started. Kizzy?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you everybody for coming and for joining this important conversation. New York City is a sanctuary city, and so we do see that women and children are disproportionately vulnerable to the effects of climate change and other kinds of disasters. So right now we are facing a variety of folks that are coming from the southern border, and they're often just facing that climate-related migration or political conflict. They're escaping and looking for a better life. We are lucky in New York City that at this moment in time, we are, our leadership, for the first time in New York City's history, we have 5 female deputy mayors. I lead the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. Thank you. And this is a new role. This is a brand new role, and I am a woman in city government for 16 years leading this Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. I think the reason this is so critical, I'll take another second here, is really when we look at the need for climate policies and how aggressive climate policy is when women are part of the decision-making body, that is really an unprecedented thing, right? And so what I love about my deputy mayors is that they come from a long line of service and labor in social service organizations, women leadership, and all of that. And so the fact that we're all in this together, setting climate policy for the years to come for New York City is really exciting.
Fantastic. Jamie?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I'll share a personal anecdote, actually, which before I started working in climate change, I worked in global health. So I spent a lot of my career in Bangladesh. And just in working there, it was very clear that when women were around the table for decision-making or, in leadership positions, they, without question, brought into the conversation what they were experiencing at home, because they were the caretakers of elders or children. They were getting the food on the table. They were taking off work when their kids were sick, and they brought that into how they made decisions at work. And I think that is what for the transformative change we need inside businesses and cities and nonprofit organizations. I think more and more we're going to have experiences of climate change impacting our own lives, and we need to bring that decision-making into the workplace. And I think women just, in my experience, in my personal life, I think we tend to do that. And that's really exciting to see more women in leadership positions bringing that perspective.
That's right.
Thank you for that question, Miranda. And Kizzy and Jamie for your responses. And I assure you, we didn't color coordinate. We were all great minds thinking alike this morning in wearing beautiful colors. I think, Miranda, I was thinking about this as I was coming, and really in the last 4 days of being in New York, I've been thinking about this, that while I completely agree, Kizzy and Jamie and Miranda, your perspective that women do bring positive change, representation of women changes the dynamic of country, society, and politics. But I've also been thinking about are we treating women as one category here? Mm-hmm. And which women are missing from the debate? So what women here are invisible? Women of color, women from the different geographies, women of different classes. Even, all of the amazing venues we've been a part of, majority of the support staff has been women. So I've been thinking about, Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality theory of 1989, that how do we not think about, great, yes, women leadership helps, and it's fantastic, it's extremely important, this is where the change will come from, but then also thinking about, while all of us women are here, which one of us are not here, and how do we make sure that they're brought in? So I think that's an important part of the conversation that I'm hoping that as the climate debate advances, we'll keep that in mind as well. And I would, I don't know if we can gender the planet or not. Can I say Mother Earth, if that's okay or not? But I think the loudest woman in the room everywhere is the planet Earth, the Mother Earth, who's telling us enough is enough. We cannot go by this adaptability theory anymore. You can't continue to extract out of me, and I'm going to respond violently if you do that. So I think listening to that woman would be very powerful.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for that. And you're reminding me, Henna, that I had intended to open at the very top by saying every week, really every day, there's a new tragic climate disaster, either in the United States or in another country, that we could pause and acknowledge and reflect on. And I'd like to ask everyone to take just a quick moment to reflect on what everyone in Puerto Rico is dealing with right now at the 5th anniversary of Hurricane Maria, and what that means for the struggle we have to make together going forward.
Right.
And as we sit with that and take it in, and there are many other examples, my example was going to be Pakistan until 2 days ago. There's a tragic overflux of examples on that. Jamie, I want to turn to you because Project Drawdown was one of the first organizations to draw real firepower to the question of women and girls and climate solutions. Can you talk about how that came about and where it led your organization's thinking?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I'm sitting here with 2 hats on, I think, that are very complementary. One is as part of Project Drawdown, and the other is part of an amazing organization called Women Plus in Climate Tech. And they, I think both of those organizations that I've been lucky to be affiliated with have come at this from 2 kind of distinct but really interrelated angles. And so at Project Drawdown, in 2017, we published a book, Drawdown, and as part of that, before we published that book, we had researchers around the world looking at the biggest solutions to climate change. And what we kept hearing over and over was, a lot of times it was the women that had the solutions in their own communities and knew sort of like what the solutions were. And so, as part of that work, we identified that, when women are, given access to rights-based education and rights-based equitable reproductive health care, that has cascading benefits for their communities, their resilience, and ultimately for the climate.
That's right.
And then as part of Women Plus in Climate Tech, it's a very similar kind of, it's a very similar situation, but they come at it kind of from the business side of things, looking at how do we accelerate the race to net zero by infusing gender equity into corporate climate strategies. And they've done really incredible work to really kind of shine a light on what those solutions are inside companies. When, as you said, Miranda, when women are in positions of leadership, on boards, helping to make decisions, those decisions tend to be, thinking longer term, and able to, really integrate climate. So I think both of those organizations that I'm lucky to be affiliated with are doing incredible work, both with the same kind of finding that gender equity is a climate solutions multiplier and a climate solution in and of itself.
Henna, takes me to your background, which is extensive in global science and STEM education. Can you talk about how climate and gender have intersected in that work, and have you seen multiplier and cascade effects?
Yeah, again, a very good question, Miranda. I complimented Miranda on the series of questions they gave us. They're like very well thought out.
That's a shout out actually to Krista and Billy, who are in the audience. So.
But I would say yes. So I've worked in my past life before I moved to the US, also actually some part of while I was in the US, I've worked in education projects, public health projects in Africa, Zambia, Malawi in particular, and in Central and South Asian countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan. And what I think has been interesting in my experience of working on the field and on the ground, and also being from the area, right? I started, I remember my first project around, my first volunteer project was working with a group of youth when I was probably a few hundred years ago, when I was 12 or 13 or 14 years old, was a street school project. So sort of really volunteering to teach women and girls, especially women and girls actually, who were spending their days getting to fetch water and were not able to go into traditional schools, and they needed alternative options. What I learned at the time and what I learn now is that I think women are very right aware in these contexts. They are aware of what they want. They're aware of what their rights are. And I think there is a little bit of a, pedagogy of the oppressed sort of a mindset, Pablo Ferreira's, where we have a banking model to education that will go and kind of teach women something absolutely new about their rights. I feel like in STEM education that I see in the US, I did a lot of work with organizations like Girls Who Code in the US, Technovation in the US. We're working with Smithsonian Science Center. And every time I work with girls, whether it is in a neighborhood in DC, New York, or if I'm working with a girl in Bangladesh, Afghanistan, you'd be surprised how rights aware they are. So there is that. And then I think so when we are going about climate education, it's more about having access to resources versus definitely importance of rights-based education, but also understanding that they understand their context a lot better than Hina or anybody else from the outside can explain to them. The multiplier effect is also an interesting one when I think about it, because we do know, right, that when we give education to women, the whole family, the whole system benefits. We know that when a woman makes more money, there is more food security in the household. We know that one educated woman can benefit the whole village. There is tons of data that proves that. And I'm a strong believer of that. But I think there is also a little bit of, thinking, which I think that is almost like I'm challenging everything that I've always stood for in life here, but also thinking about multiplier effect is very, very important, absolutely, and it is true, we know that to be true by data, but then also recognizing women's humanity to have access to all of this, and not always thinking about, I'm investing this in women, what is the return on investment? So I think that is also a sort of a mindset shift that I would at least want to practice myself and encourage, because I'm okay to exist as a human, and the benefit that I get, whether it is a good night's sleep or a good education or access to food, should not be only because of the return on investment.
Absolutely. There's the intrinsic value in it. Kizzy, any reflections on Henna's comments across your long history as a climate justice leader, first in nonprofits, in both here in Harlem and in Detroit, and now you're running things for New York City. So how do you
look at all this gray hair? I'm definitely running things, guys.
So you have to you have to think about women as change agents, and of course, I know you well. You're thinking about our intrinsic humanity and how that matters as well. How do you balance those things?
Yeah, thank you for that. And so we're now best friends. So we'll get
Here.
Here. The amazing thing about the comments is, again, to me, I come to this work from a very personal place. I grew up in New York City. I'm an immigrant. I still live 4 blocks from my old high school in Brooklyn. It's a public school, right? I always had a exposure and kind of to very needy neighborhoods and schools that were under-resourced and labs where we had to share books and share the resources there. And ultimately what I came across as my family just put all of their hopes and dreams and aspirations into my education, you know, and sent me to a STEM program, and it was like, oh, she's a geologist, she will mine for oil. And I was like, no, actually, the thing I really learned and cared about was health disparities and how that showed up in the classrooms. And the way that it showed up in the classrooms was asthma, was obesity, was diabetes, was like an environment where it was hard to learn and hard to advance and hard to get out of this cycle of poverty, right? Because of the effect that the regular natural environment around us had, the traffic, the lack of open space, the fact that our homes weren't healthy, the lead in the walls, right? So to me, I didn't come to this because I wanted to run the world. I came into this work very seriously because to be a full human is to have your environment not be the thing that's killing you because of decisions that have been made by a corporation, by a government, right? And so everybody talks about access as if we come to the table, we have to be at the table. This table, where is this table? There is no point of you being at the table if you're here with your inhaler, right? Are you a full part of the conversation if you don't have your health, right? And so I think that's the biggest piece that I bring to this when I think about New York City and our poverty-stricken neighborhoods, our underinvested neighborhoods, the tremendous effects that we still see from systemic racism, redlining, underinvestment. Those were decisions that were made. My job is to help redress them. My job is to also show all New York City high school kids that are like me, Latinas, Latinos, right, that it is possible, that we can come and do this, and that we owe you better. We can do better as government for you, and we have to do that through you all, right? Like our partners, the nonprofit sector, often led by women. Social justice organizations, mutual aid, often led by women, often there to provide better lives and better services for women and children. And to me, like that is that cycle. We can't be full participants in our economic prosperity if we are not thriving inside our homes, right? And those homes are primarily female-headed, right? Especially in poor areas. So yeah, to me, I'm bringing them along. And my family's now proud. They were very upset at first. Thank you.
I feel like you all are embodying a response to this question, but Henna, as part of our pivot to talking about where things are now, we had discussed a question about what are the challenges and opportunities that you see with your communications background in communicating about gender and the climate crisis. So if there's something you'd want to add to that, you've already more than touched on, but we're all ears.
Oh, thank you. So it's a very interesting time to be in a sort of a communication/strategy type role in GM, because I think communication is playing a very active role that goes beyond campaigning, that goes beyond here's a press release, that goes beyond here are your talking points. We're really now working with the teams to inform strategy, and to some extent even keeping our internal stakeholders informed and accountable. So I think those two roles specifically, Amanda, I'm seeing happen more, Miranda, in my communications role more often. I said Amanda because I work with an Amanda. She's lovely. So there is that side of it. I think another side of it that I think we're noticing a lot, and I think it's so important, is the sort of a claim fatigue that we have, how we're communicating around these things. So all of the companies are making claims. A lot of these claims are pretty far ahead. In the communication side, we're thinking about the urgency of action. We're thinking about the transparency of how we're talking about things. And we're really thinking about tangible actions. What is it that we can do now to make the change happen? And how do we advocate for them, for that within our companies as well? So I think there is that element to it. I would say another side of this is also what I see is the climate communication generally has to shift, whether it is from a gendered lens or social justice lens beyond, is there is a bit of what I would call academic elitism. You know, nobody's there walking around with the glossaries of term and climate science, climate change. How do we simplify the messages while nobody's walking around with a glossary of term? People, again, understand what's happening in their surrounding. I understood what was happening in my surrounding regarding health, regarding access to water, regarding access to resources.
That's right.
So sort of really simplifying and understanding that people, again, giving up on the academic elitism and simplifying the message, whether we're talking about climate change in a more broad way or specifically through a gendered lens.
Amazing. That's great.
Sometimes there seems to be an investment in making it inaccessible, almost, right? There can be a kind of competitive gesture toward speaking in a way that makes it harder to understand.
Give it up for the acronyms.
100%. Alphabet soup.
Exactly.
Jamie, how have you seen the understanding and communications about women, or more broadly gender and climate change over the past few years since you've been working in this terrain?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot. I'd be curious to hear Kezia and Henna's thoughts too, but certainly, you know, in the time that Project Drawdown has been, you know, kind of talking about this as a climate solution, and my colleague Catherine Wilkinson, who really wrote, you know, who was a big evangelist for this as a climate solution and then launched the nonprofit All We Can Save. I think this has really, you know, kind of become part of how we, at least in the climate community, you know, embedded in how we talk about climate solutions. You know, and one of the kind of landmark reports that we put out at Project Drawdown last year was to really look at the connections, you know, the connections between climate solutions and all the other things that we care about. So equity and health and, you know, safer places to live and resilience. And we came up with, you know, that there are 28 out of the 100 climate solutions that Project Drawdown has analyzed. 28 of them, you know, specifically address either poverty alleviation or equity, things like clean cooking that in, you know, lower and middle income countries are like a huge, you know, that's a huge negative health impact for women cooking inside their homes, and to shift to clean cooking is a major, major benefit to their health 100%. And a climate solution. So more and more, you know, I think we are really trying to amplify those solutions that do address, I mean, yeah, there are, you know, carbon capture, all the, like, those are things that we're gonna eventually need, but like things that improve people's lives and like improve all of the other things that make us, you know, full human beings and able to, you know, enjoy our lives and, you know, contribute to this amazing, you know, issue of climate change. I think that's where we need to really, really focus our efforts. So that's the shift that we've made in the last year, and one I'm very excited about.
It's such a positive change. Obviously, long distance to go, but
That's really
a lot of distance traveled. So. Shifting to where we are now in terms of policy, and Kizzy, turning to you, you've already spoken about the intense expression of racism in how climate impacts are distributed, and how that ties into both historical and present day practices.
Yep.
Can you talk a little about what the city is doing right now? And later I'll have a question for you about future directions, but what are you guys doing right now that you'd like us to know about to address these questions, which couldn't possibly be more critical for our common future, for everybody's future.
For everybody's future.
Do you think about it in terms of gender? If not asking you to force a rhyme, but is there a gendered component to how you think about it?
Yep, thank you for that question. Let's put it this way. I was announced by Mayor Adams at the end of January. It feels like dog years. And we had a very clear charge. There were 4 separate offices that did climate work in the city of New York, and they each had their silos: resiliency, sustainability, environmental remediation over there. We brought them all together, and we gave them a new leader, and that was me. And the goal is to coordinate climate action through an environmental justice lens and an environmental health perspective. And that hopefully is, we're 9 months in, but to me that is going to feel and be different policy making for the next 4 years, for sure. One of the key things of doing that is ensuring that we are always thinking about climate policy, not just as something that we're planning for in 2050 or 2100. That is really important. What we need is coordinated action that is really people focused, and that is also thinking about environmental quality of life today. So for sure on the communication side, I don't want to put yet another map in front of people about here's what we're doing in 2050 and here's the project that will take us 20 years to complete. Those are all very important, right? But there is a way that, say on Monday, we announced $112 million worth of investment for tree planting in heat vulnerable communities across New York City, right? So that was our Monday announcement. Obviously, because of COVID, we had a decrease in our planting rates in the last couple of fiscal years, but we just had our record-breaking tree planting rate amount, and we are dedicating, the Adams administration is dedicating the significant amount of funding. The reason that matters is that, again, the goal here is targeted investments to redress the effects of redlining and disinvestment that has happened over the last 10,000 years, right? And so it's like you can't just invest in the shiny thing. Yes, if you have to drive a car, I would hope it is a hybrid, and I would hope we have the charging infrastructure that is needed, but ultimately I need investments in public transit. I need investments that benefit renters, not just homeowners, because most of New York City is made up of renters, right? And I need things that actually improve our streetscape so that grandma is not baking in her 5-story walk-up during a heat wave because she thinks that the street is too hot when really the danger is inside of her apartment, right? So that is the gender piece, right? That with poverty comes a vulnerability to climate issues that doesn't need to be there if we're more thoughtful about how we devise and how we invest our capital dollars.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
And congratulations on that announcement and commitments.
More to come, more to come.
It's great. Jamie, Women Plus in Climate Tech has focused a lot on educational and economic opportunities for women. How have you seen that play out in terms of co-benefits related to climate? For example, are there reductions in the specific harms that women sometimes experience after climate disasters, the risks of violence, and so on? Can you tell us about the co-benefit side of things?
Yeah. Well, Women Plus in Climate Tech is an amazing organization that's made up of 1,000 or more women from around the world who work in climate tech, which is obviously a space that is dominated by men, I would say, still. And they really went through this incredible process last year of like going out and listening to women who work in climate tech and identifying like what are the ways that we can integrate, not just financial considerations and the ESG aspects, but actually look at gender and how gender is not just important as an add-on, but like an integral part of any business strategy, and actually identifying ways that gender equity can help accelerate companies toward their net zero targets. And so with things like the Miranda you mentioned earlier, that women in certain in decision making in positions of decision making or in parliaments that are predominantly made up of women, their environmental treaties are more likely to be passed, and inside companies the decisions and the timelines for net zero tend to be faster. There tend to be interim targets. So there's a lot of amazing research that has been done in a report that was recently released called Accelerating the Race to Net Zero, Integrating Gender Equity to Accelerate Companies' Climate Strategies. So that's really, I work with a lot of companies and investors as part of my job at Project Drawdown. And I think this is a really important gap that we have not seen addressed before in the private sector. So yeah, having gender equity integrated into corporate sustainability strategy, I think is going to be a really key trend when all of the benefits of that we're talking about today.
And at General Motors, Hannah, there's the Climate Equity Fund, which is also doing this work that Jamie's just been talking about. Tell us about that, and tell us about any impacts that you've seen to date, particularly as they relate to gender, if the Spirit so moves you.
Yeah. So once upon a time, 2 years ago, me and a colleague at General Motors, Jessica James, reached out to our chief communications officer, and we said that we would want you to reach out to the board and request for equitable climate action funding. That means that we want to have this active understanding that when it comes to climate change, there is a level of differential vulnerability. That means that not all communities, not all genders are affected equally when it comes to climate change. And we can see the example of that in Pakistan, right? While we're having this amazing conference in New York and this great climate week in New York, which is fantastic, there is some 1,100 plus people dead in the country. 1/3 of the country is underwater. 33 million climate refugees exist. And this is a country which is just 1% emitter of CO2 in the world. So we can really see live right now in front of our eyes that there is differential vulnerability when it comes to climate change. So at General Motors specifically, Miranda, we sort of had that conversation early on when I took that role and work with my colleagues to how do we bring that thinking into how we are strategizing around all the things that we do in the company. So we launched what we call the Equitable Climate Action. The Equitable Climate Action, we focus on 4 specific areas. The first is workforce transition or future of work. So how do we make sure as the company makes a transition from ICE vehicles to EV vehicles, how do we make sure that we are taking the workforce along? The other part of the second pillar of equitable climate action is EV access. So making sure that we're not just making electric vehicles that are just for bros and dudes, we're making EV vehicles that are affordable at all price points, all genders, whatever gender you identify with, you can access. We also have a strong focus on infrastructure equity. We know that, again, the highest income households or the highest income neighborhood have the highest number of EV chargers compared to multi-dwelling households or low-income neighborhoods. So infrastructure equity is another part of it. And the fourth pillar, which I think is the most important pillar, because that's when we get to work with a number of grassroots organizations across the US and the world, which is a climate equity fund, which is a $50 million climate equity fund that's going directly into the grassroots organizations that are working towards workforce training, that are working towards gender equity, that are working towards making sure that the communities that are impacted by climate change get the benefit of the funding to get ready to build climate resiliency and climate adaptation. So I would say that equitable climate action really, and the point that I made earlier, that communication is no more just about here is a press release and here is a talking point,
right.
But really we can go back and to the company and to the CEO and inform, we need to think about this from an equity lens, let's do it, and can have internal buy-in and advocacy.
That's right. Great.
That's extraordinary. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Well, we've now gotten to the point of addressing what we want to see in the future. And we'll do that relatively quickly to give all of you a chance to ask questions of these extraordinary human beings. First, Janie, I want to ask you a quick question about the plus in Women Plus in climate tech. Can you talk a little bit about how gender minorities, how gender diversity has come to be understood in relation to climate since you've been in this field? For example, people who are non-binary. How has that come to be understood as a climate-related question in this ranging conversation about the necessity of moving toward universal human equality?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that is really an evolving space right now. And I'd be curious to hear both of your thoughts as well. But I think, when it comes to kind of aid and access to, to after like a climate-related natural disaster, access to healthcare, especially gender-based. If there's healthcare that's only accessible to, certain genders, that's a major problem and one that needs to be addressed. And so I think when we think about climate impacts in terms of, gender and sexuality, that it needs to, this needs to be a full representation. And I think we're starting to see that. I'd be curious if either of you have thoughts on that as well.
Me too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can add a little bit here. I think I was just looking at some of the recent things that UN is doing in this front. I came across this thing that they were talking about. They designated women and LGBTQ plus community as a sort of an extra vulnerable community within the context of climate change. So I think that's a positive change. I think that's something that can be adopted and should be adopted across the corporate world and across governments as well. Another thing that's very important, I think, looking at climate mitigation also through a gendered lens, because we do know that it is women who are working in agricultural fields, whether it is India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, 80 to 90% women who are producing food. The food that is produced in these countries is by women. It is women who go and fetch water and have to give up an education. So water insecurity and water crisis impacts them the most. It is women who have to go through sexual assault or have to go to increase in domestic violence when homes are displaced and when there is financial insecurity. So we do know that women are taking care of the livestock, livelihood. We do know that women are taking care of agriculture, food production in the economy. We do know that they're taking care of, as you mentioned, of elderly at home when a crisis happened. So I think in terms of when we talk about climate mitigation and climate adaptation, both of them have to be very, very specifically gendered. It has to be a gendered lens. I think there is no other way around it. And I would say specifically, again, in Pakistan example, right, I was again following the news there and talking to a few friends, and I was talking to a friend who is running this project which is called Mahwari Justice, which Mahwari in Farsi or Urdu means periods. And her whole focus is around being able to provide sanitary napkins to women who are now displaced. So there is 8 million women who are displaced right now that are in reproductive age. So think about it, right?
That's right.
I mean, we've all been out on the street going around, and if you're on your period, what are you going to do about it? And if you're displaced by floods, there is no food, there is nowhere to go, there is no sanitation available to you. What happens to you in that situation? Again, maternal reproduction challenges, right? So I think a big part of, as I'm looking at all the funding and disaster relief announcement, the disaster relief that happens post a climate disaster also has to be gendered, because there is going to be 73,000 women in Pakistan that are off of the 8 million that are displaced, 73,000 will be delivering children next month. Oof. What happens to them? What happens to you when you have to deliver a child on the side of the street? So your disaster strategy has to be gendered. So I think these issues, women are producing food, they are taking care of livestock, they're taking care of agriculture. So when you're talking about climate mitigation and when you're talking about climate disaster relief, keeping them out is I think would be the greatest tragedy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You've said it so beautifully. It's absolutely so critical to have that intersectional lens to climate work. And this is why, really, what I always say to people is that when you wake up in the morning, you just, you brush your teeth. And you do that because you think that's the thing that we have to do. And when we wake up in the morning, we should be saying, how am I showing up for racial justice today? How am I showing up for climate justice today? And that is the reason, right? It should be embedded in the work that everybody does, whether you're a medical doctor, a journalist, whether you're now starting, a food prep. Ultimately, women are part of all of these of all of these circles, and we really do need everybody in order to address the climate crisis. Since you took a moment to describe the mitigation side of the conversation, let me give you an example of something we did here, and maybe that transitions us into what I want to see in the future for the adaptation side. So again, for the city of New York, we understood that New Yorkers were dying from heat exposure in their homes because they were poor, right? They are poor. They are worried about their electricity bill, so they don't run an air conditioner or they don't own one. They think the street is too hot, so they don't go to the cooling centers that the city of New York coordinates and provides, right? So they were just isolated New Yorkers that we don't have a strong handle on how to help. And we have several heat waves per year, right? I know it's feeling cool today, but just this August, we had 11 days over 90 degrees, right? And we're only projected to be more and more in need of adaptation strategies around heat resiliency. We launched a buddy program Because again, the trusted messenger doesn't always have to be government. They don't want to hear from the bureaucrats, okay? Like, they need the women in their community. We went to their community health workers and we trained them, right? They're medical professionals. They're the meteorologists. Those are actually in the literature, trusted messengers, the medical doctors, right? The social workers. And they receive messages from them very differently than they receive them from emergency managers or from government or even from just the news, right? So we created this buddy program, and it turns out that most of the women that volunteer, most of the people that volunteer were women, most of the people that they serve were women, and many were low-income people. And so we activated them like a muscle, right? Like several times over the course of heat waves, and it turns out that then when COVID happened, they already had that social resiliency built in, those relationships built in. They didn't need us at all. They were checking on each other, on those people during COVID, doing wellness checks. You know what I mean? So here's my ask. The interesting thing is that to launch that buddy program, the city government had to bend over backwards to get the funding to the small organizations that then would launch those volunteer systems. Where's philanthropy, folks? You can't continue to fund the same large environmental organizations over and over because it's easy to go through fiscal with them, right? You need to require that they have that intersectional climate lens and that they're actually trickling down, and they shouldn't be trickling down because their overhead is too damn high. They should be funding, they should be required to bring along the partnerships at the community level that are actually going to do the life-saving work, right? And move the needle in the right direction, even in the advocacy space, right? So that's the bottom line. It was hard for government to, we are clunky to give a tiny grant to a tiny organization. Where was philanthropy for mutual aid? Why should it be a GoFundMe? Like, there is no sustainability in that if you and I always have to be the ones coming together every disaster. There's no strategy in that. It's just reactive. So we need both governments, as we have a historic amount of funding coming down, right, from the federal government to the states, but mostly also the organizations that are more nimble, the private sector, the corporations, the philanthropic organizations, to actually resource on-the-ground response strategies so that those women can find sanitary napkins. That is climate justice.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
I won't make this a group quiz question because we're short on time, but for anybody who didn't already know, I'll also note the percentage of overall global philanthropy that goes to anything climate-related is 2%.
2%.
Not 20, not 75, 2%.
Yep, that's right.
To put it very politely, irrational.
Irrational.
So super quickly, and then we're going to take a couple of quick questions. What's one advocacy act that you would ask of our audience? Hannah.
Why me first?
We know you have many, and you've sketched a vision of justice that will motivate us all.
All right,
But if there's one thing you want people to take home, what is it?
Okay, I think one thing that actually I had been thinking about a lot, again, in the past few days, as there is this weird challenge, right, being from a country that's underwater right now, and then being at a climate conference in New York. I can tell you I haven't slept well in the past many days, just kind of this almost, am I a hypocrite? Am I supposed to be here? Do I belong in the room? Should I even be speaking on these topics? I think one thing that I think about and remind myself from trying to answer the question, Miranda, there, and I think Viola Davis said that recently, was around being ready to pay the cost. I think that if there is anything you want to stand up for as an advocate, whether it is within a corporation, whether it is in the government, whether it is in your family, you have to know that there is going to be a cost. And I think if you know that there is going to be a cost, you're going to work that much harder to make it happen. So I think from my perspective, from an advocacy perspective, and to the advocates that are fighting for climate justice, that are fighting for women's rights, for women who are visible and those who are not visible, who are not here and not having the opportunity to be a part of the panels and to be the part of the audiences, I think, especially for women who are here, we should know that if you want to stand up for something, you have to be ready to pay the cost. and I think that's okay.
That's fantastic. People don't say that often enough.
They do not.
Thank you. Jamie.
To pick one thing is really challenging because I think everyone is so different and we all have our own superpowers. So, you know, what is your climate superpower, climate justice superpower? How do you integrate that into, you know, as many aspects of your life as you can holistically? So, I mean, you know, whether you work inside of a big corporation or, you know, an investment firm or you're, you know, work in the Amazon warehouse. Like I worked with the Amazon Employees for Climate Justice, who were a group of Amazon workers, thank you, who became like 7,000 in number. They were like,
100%.
you know, workers in the warehouse. They were, you know, the delivery drivers, coders, marketers. And they came together and said, like, enough is enough. We need to integrate climate justice throughout the company. And then, you know, that then became a COVID, you know, taking care of warehouse workers during COVID. It, you know, I think find your superpower, find your strength, and apply, you know, as much of what this, you know, these incredible women shared today into your life.
Excellent. Izzy.
Well, apparently I'm the no fun person in the group because I have a long list of things I want you to do. But if I only have 5 seconds, what I want to actually ask you to do every single day is to think that your job is to redress the tremendous effects of our history of white supremacy, colonization, and racism across the entire globe. And that sounds really big. No, but what that means is don't for a second think that that is those brown people's job over there. And so I just get to live my life regularly. There's no cost I have to pay. There's no change I have to make. There's no additional conversation I have to have, right? Like, how are you showing up for a more fair world, whether you are trying to you know, be the investment banker, whether you are trying to be this high school teacher, whether you're trying to be the medical doctor, whether you're trying to be the government bureaucrat. How are we showing up for racial justice? There's no climate justice, there's no climate work that isn't housing policy, that isn't immigration policy. So you have to address the underlying barrier of all that, and race is a big indicator.
Thank you all so much. What an extraordinary conversation. I want to ask if we can have a few audience questions. We're a little over time, but it's also the end of the day.
Oh.
Wow. Hi, my name is Ayla. I'm a journalism student at NYU, and one of my main priorities with being a journalism major and a journalist is that I want to highlight the stories of people who are underrepresented and who are who are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And my question is, what should I be mindful of when covering these stories and interacting with communities that I'm not involved in?
I will take that question. We are very mindful of that, and especially as we have done a lot of our work on heat resiliency, reporters come to the city all the time and say, okay, we need a person, we need somebody, grandma, where you keep talking about grandma in her top floor apartment. People are private, and they don't want to be under the microscope in an extractive way. It takes time, and often your deadline is too fast for that relationship building to actually happen. We say that heat is a silent killer, it happens indoors, and it is hard for reporters to come into someone's space and for them to feel comfortable and not feel that you're going to shame them for their poverty. And I think that coming into the work with humility and in their own terms and at their own time, and don't rush them. Don't be like, my deadline is at noon, so can I talk to you right this moment? Again, those that are most disproportionately affected by the climate crisis are also having a ton to manage. They're heads of household, they work too many hours, they're underpaid, they're overworked. They may want to talk to you, but they actually have some anger and some shame, and you can't, you have to come at it with a lot of love. We're doing climate work because we love people and we love the planet and we're trying to survive, right? So they will see that from you if you come correct. So in any neighborhood, you come correct.
That was beautiful.
Miranda, if you allow me to add to that answer, I would also say that, you know, thinking a little bit about, and I'm sure you can give me more advice than I can give you, so don't take it as advice, but just something that I've been thinking about, that who's missing from the story and who's missing from the narrative and who's owning the narrative. I feel like I had this conversation in a different panel that I was a part of, that there is an important, it's our responsibility to topple the hero's narrative. So who's getting to tell the story and who's missing from the story and who's not represented here, who's not visible here. I think trying to go deeper and finding that would also be important for all of us, not just for journalists, but for all of us.
Yeah.
One more quick question.
Oh.
Let's go over here.
You have a tough job, Miranda.
Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to ask you about gender quotas. If you think they are a positive discrimination or if you think they are a necessary measurement to create meaningful change, especially in climate justice.
So I know a couple of years back, there was legislation in France, I don't know its current status, but I think this is parallel to what you mean, that required 50% of local legislative representation to consist of, I think it was only women. There was no plus at the time, so it's probably more than 2 years ago. But I think that's what the question is getting at.
Yeah.
Do you think we need to have aggressive goals, and I'll add for racial representation as well as gender representation in positions of leadership?
Yeah, I think this is it's a great question, by the way. You got us all thinking. But I also think it's almost like a complicated social experiment, and perhaps we'll learn more about it as we go on. But I think what I have noticed, especially in my former life experiences of working in Afghanistan, for example, where during the American control, there was a lot of push on increasing women legislators, and there were benefits of that, right? So if 10 women were able to be in the parliament from 0, out of those 10, maybe 9 were appointed by their brothers and fathers and uncles instead of them, and were supposed to be their mouth boxes in the parliament. There may be one woman who was able to kind of, slide in and was able to be an authentic voice, for example. Similarly, I think in Pakistan, we've seen that as well, quota-related impact. And I would say, I wouldn't call it positive discrimination. I would say we need more reparation and correction, on this subject. And I always think about it, this is a very modern millennial kind of a conversation I have with my friends, and Gen Z also. I see a lot of Gen Z here, which is great. Is that if you go out on a date with somebody and you're at a dinner table, and after you're done eating, who should take the bill? Should the man take it? Should it be 50-50? And I always tell them, no, it's never 50-50 until we get paid equally. So I think it's, we could do 70-30 maybe, I'll order a steak, a few drinks. But I think we have to think about these things from that perspective. They cannot be any equality when we have had hundreds of years of inequity. So you've got to think about it from the lens of not just equality, but equity, and I would call it perhaps reparation and anti-discrimination versus positive discrimination.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Fantastic. Yeah. But I'm going to ask everyone to do something that's going to seem a little strange at first. Hold your hands up and get ready for a single short percussive clap.
Us too.
Yes, you guys as well. Thank you. So the first thing I want to do is hugely thank the Nest Summit campus for putting this extraordinary 2 days together, and also thank our partners at the Javits Center, at New York City and Company, and at Climate Week NYC.
Yeah.
So I'm going to count to 3, and then we'll do 1 clap in unison. So the rhythm is 1, 2, 3, and then the clap. And you'll see how much you like it. Okay, so a huge thank you to all the aforementioned superstars. 1, 2, 3. And next, I just want to honor the 3 extraordinary people sitting next to me and ask that we do a second clap for racial and gender equity and for love in honor of these 3 humans. 1, 2, 3. Outstanding. Thank you all.
Thank you for coming.